He came to the Carolina marshlands to bury his past, to let the stillness wash away what the war had left behind. For Ethan Cole, a Navy veteran with quiet scars and a loyal dog named Shadow, peace was supposed to be simple. But after the storm, Shadow dragged something from the reeds, an orange life vest tangled in roots, harmless at first glance. Then Ethan saw it, one strap cleanly cut, not torn. It wasn't debris, it was a warning. When the local deputy arrived, his smile was thin, his words colder than the marsh itself. "In these waters, mister, some things are better left sunk." That night, the crickets stopped singing. And Ethan realized the marsh wasn't just holding secrets, it was guarding something worth killing for. The air that morning was the kind that clung to skin, cold yet damp, the breath of late autumn curling over the surface of Stillwater Lake like thin silver smoke. The storm had passed just hours before, leaving the forest washed clean but uneasy, as though the wind had whispered something it shouldn't have. Jack Turner stood at the edge of his porch, the wood creaking under his boots, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand. He was a tall man in his late 30s, built from lean muscle rather than bulk, the kind of strength honed not in gyms, but in long years of carrying weight that wasn't always physical. His hair, once jet black, now held streaks of ash near the temples, and a few days' worth of beard roughened his sharp jawline. There was a quiet precision to the way he moved, like someone who never fully left the discipline of the Navy. He'd come here to Montana to start over, to let the cold silence of the lake drown the echoes that still shouted behind his eyelids at night. Jack's house stood on a small rise overlooking Stillwater, a cabin of cedar logs with smoke-stained rafters and a porch that faced the water. The paint was fading, and the window frames bore scars from countless winters, but it was home, or at least something close to the word. He'd bought it unseen, guided by a real estate agent's grainy photos and the need to be as far from the noise of men as he could manage. From this perch, the world looked untouched. Pines marched down the slopes in perfect green ranks, and the lake stretched wide and dark, reflecting a sky that was just beginning to remember blue. At his feet, Cooper stirred. The 5-year-old German Shepherd was massive for his breed, his fur a dark mix of sable and gold that shimmered where sunlight broke through the mist. His ears twitched to every distant sound, and his amber eyes carried an alert intelligence that sometimes made Jack feel as if the dog understood far more than he should. Cooper wasn't just a companion. He was the tether that held Jack to the world when the nightmares tried to pull him under. He'd found the dog 3 years ago, tied to a rusted gate behind a gas station outside Houston. Someone had abandoned him there, ribs showing, tail tucked low. Jack had unfastened the rope without a word, and in that single moment, a quiet understanding formed between them. Two souls left behind, choosing each other out of shared silence. This morning, Cooper stood stiff, nose twitching, eyes locked on the shoreline below. The storm had littered the water's edge with branches and reed, a mosaic of nature's debris. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, setting his coffee down and following the dog's gaze. Cooper barked once, sharp, urgent, not the playful bark he used when chasing squirrels. Jack's stomach tightened. He knew that tone. It was the same tone Cooper used when they'd stumbled on that wounded deer last winter, a sound threaded with instinct and warning. Jack trudged down the slope toward the water, boots sinking into wet earth. The smell of rain mixed with the metallic tang of pine sap. He squinted against the glare of light rippling off the lake's surface until he saw it. Something caught among the roots of a fallen willow, a flash of unnatural red amid the muted greens and browns. For a brief second, he thought it was trash, just another relic of careless campers. But as he drew closer, his gut said otherwise. The object bobbed gently, half submerged, the bright red dulled by mud and water. It was a life vest. Jack crouched, the leather of his gloves squeaking as he reached into the cold water. The vest was heavier than it should have been, waterlogged and tangled in roots. He tugged once, twice, and with a wet, sucking sound, it came free, splattering his jeans. Cooper sniffed it, ears flattened slightly, tail stiff. Jack turned it over in his hands, droplets of lake water tracing dark paths down the faded lettering on the back. U.S. Coastline Equipment, it read, a brand he recognized from his Navy years. He ran a thumb along the edge of one strap. It wasn't frayed, it wasn't torn. It had been cut, cleanly, deliberately, with something sharp. A chill prickled the back of his neck. In his mind, he could still hear his old commanding officer's voice, clipped and distant over the comms. "We have our orders. It was an accident. Sign the report, Turner." That word, accident, had followed him for years, like a stain that refused to wash out. He exhaled slowly, fighting the sudden spike of adrenaline that made his pulse drum in his ears. "It's just a vest," he muttered, more to himself than to Cooper. "Could be anything." But the words rang hollow. The sky had turned the color of tarnished silver, the reflection of clouds rippling on the lake's surface. Jack stood there for a long moment, holding the vest as if it might speak. Cooper sat beside him, head tilted, waiting. The wind carried a sound, something between a sigh and a whisper from across the water. It was probably nothing more than air through pine branches, but it made Jack's skin crawl all the same. He took the vest back to the porch, laying it out across the railing to dry. The red looked garish against the soft tones of wood and fog. Cooper paced restlessly, tail flicking. Jack tried to busy himself with routine, checking the generator, sorting his supplies, but his mind kept circling back to the same image, the cut strap, the stillness of the lake, the weight of something unseen. When the sun began to dip behind the ridgeline, he poured himself another cup of coffee and sat on the porch steps. The lake mirrored the fading light, turning from blue to gold to black. Cooper settled at his side, resting his head on Jack's boot. The night sounds began, the distant call of a loon, the rhythmic croak of frogs, the whisper of wind in the trees. It should have been peaceful. It should have been everything he'd come here for. But Jack's chest felt tight, his body humming with unease. He thought about the man he used to be, the officer who trusted procedure, who believed in clean endings and signed reports. That man had drowned somewhere in the Pacific, under orders and guilt. The man sitting here now was supposed to be rebuilding, breathing again. But the lake had other plans. It was as if it had looked into him and recognized one of its own, a vessel of secrets too heavy to stay buried. Cooper's sudden growl snapped him from his thoughts. The dog was standing now, muscles rigid, ears pricked toward the tree line behind the house. Jack's eyes followed, but he saw only shadows, the dark smudge of pine trunks, the faint shimmer of dew on leaves. "Probably a deer," he said softly, though the reassurance was for himself. The growl faded, but Cooper didn't sit. His gaze stayed fixed on the woods. Jack stood, the boards of the porch groaning beneath his weight. The last light drained from the sky, and in its place rose a heavy, suffocating stillness. He glanced down at the life vest on the railing, the red almost glowing in the half-light. For an instant, he thought he saw something dark smear across its surface, a trick of shadow, like fingers reaching through the fabric. He blinked, and it was gone. "Come on, boy," he murmured, stepping back inside. The cabin door shut with a hollow thud. Outside, the lake lapped softly against the shore, whispering secrets to the wind. And beneath that placid surface, something stirred, something waiting to be found. The sound of an approaching engine reached Jack before he saw the vehicle itself, a deep, uneven rumble that carried across Stillwater's quiet morning. The air was still damp from last night's storm, the scent of pine resin hanging heavy. Jack stood on the porch, hands in the pockets of his worn jacket, watching as a beige county pickup came crawling up the dirt path. The logo on the door, Pine Hollow Sheriff's Department, was faded and flaking. A man climbed out slowly, slamming the truck door with unnecessary force. Deputy Harris was built like a man who had spent more time at diners than in gyms, thick around the middle, his khaki shirt straining slightly at the buttons. He was in his late 50s, skin leathered by sun and tobacco, and the deep lines around his mouth looked carved rather than aged. His hair, once black, was now the dull color of wet gravel, and a thin gray mustache framed lips that seemed to smirk even when they didn't mean to. He moved with a casual slowness, as though daring the world to rush him. Yet his eyes, small, sharp, a shade between blue and steel, missed nothing. "Mornin'," Harris drawled, resting one hand on his belt where his badge caught the light. "Heard we've got ourselves a newcomer. Jack Turner, right? The Navy man." Jack nodded. "That's me." His tone was polite but guarded. "Something I can help you with, Deputy?" "Storm blew half the county into the lake," Harris said, glancing around the porch. "We're checking in on folks, making sure no one found anything that don't belong to them. Sometimes things wash up that ain't good to keep. His gaze landed on the red life vest hanging over the porch railing, its color bright against the gray morning. His smirk deepened just slightly. Like that, for instance. Jack didn't move. Found it near the shore this morning. Looked recent. Thought it might be worth reporting. Harris stepped closer, his boots thudding on the wood. He poked the vest lightly with one finger, like someone testing a wound. "Storm trash," he said finally, his drawl slow and sticky. "Could have come from anywhere. Folks lose things out there all the time. Boats, vests, sometimes their damn minds." He laughed once, but it was the kind of laugh that left no warmth behind. Jack studied the man's face. "A man went missing last week, didn't he? Hank Doyle." His wife posted flyers in town. For the first time, Harris's easy posture stiffened. The smile froze on his lips. "That's so," he said after a pause, his voice suddenly lighter, almost amused. "A lot of people go missing, Turner. Mountains, rivers, they don't play nice. Doyle was a drinker. Could have wandered into the water himself. Happens more than you'd think." Jack folded his arms. "Strap on that vest was cut clean. Doesn't look like something the river did." Harris looked up, his eyes narrowing. The silence between them stretched until even saw it. The wind seemed to stop moving. Then, with deliberate slowness, he straightened and tipped his hat. "Tell you what, sailor. You see something that makes you lose sleep, you come tell me. Otherwise, best let the water mind its own business." He turned to go, boots scraping the damp earth, but before climbing into his truck, he paused. His words floated back, soft yet heavy as stones. "Water's deep here in Pine Hollow, son, and folks who stir it up tend to get pulled under." The engine roared to life, and the pickup rolled away, leaving behind a haze of dust that hung in the air long after it should have settled. Jack stood motionless, the chill of the warning sinking in like cold rain. Cooper, who had been watching the exchange from the porch, let out a low growl, the fur along his back bristling. Jack reached down to calm him, but his own hand trembled slightly. That evening, the lake was unnervingly still. The sunset bled across the water like diluted wine, and the pines threw long, trembling shadows across the shore. Jack sat on the porch steps, the life vest lying beside him, its red now a darker shade under the fading light. Cooper lay at his feet, ears flicking at every distant rustle. He thought about Harris, the smug drawl, the hollow laughter, the way his eyes had gone flat when he mentioned Doyle's name. There had been something rehearsed about it, like a man reciting a story he didn't quite believe. Jack's instincts, sharpened by years of reading men under pressure, told him one thing: the deputy wasn't dismissing him out of ignorance. He was warning him. The storm returned that night, not outside but in Jack's sleep. It started, as it always did, with the clang of metal and the smell of burning fuel. Then the shouting, the voice of a boy he could never forget. "Lieutenant Turner, help!" He was back on the deck of the destroyer, water and fire merging into one endless nightmare. Miller was trapped below deck, his young face streaked with oil, eyes wide in terror. Jack remembered the order in his ear. "Seal the hatch. We can't lose the ship." He'd obeyed, locking the door, hearing the screams fade beneath the roar of the sea. When the storm of guilt finally spat him out, it was in darkness again. He woke with a strangled gasp, drenched in sweat, heart hammering like artillery fire. The room was pitch black save for the faint light spilling from the window. For a disoriented moment, he didn't know where he was. Then he felt the weight on his chest, steady, solid, real. Cooper's head rested there, his warm breath ghosting against Jack's skin. The dog's eyes glowed faintly in the dark, full of quiet concern. Jack reached up, fingers curling into the thick fur at Cooper's neck. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm here, buddy." Outside, thunder rolled far away, soft and distant, like the memory of cannons over the sea. The lake murmured beneath the storm, its voice low and secretive. Somewhere, beyond the trees, a branch cracked, a small sound easily forgotten, but Cooper lifted his head, ears pricked, staring into the darkness. Jack followed his gaze but saw nothing. Still, for reasons he couldn't name, a cold unease spread through him. When he finally drifted back to sleep, the last thing he heard was the soft lap of water against the shore, and underneath it, faint and hollow, a sound that might have been a splash or a voice calling his name. The morning light over Stillwater Lake carried a pale, wintry hue, the kind that made even the pine trees look like they were holding their breath. Jack Turner sat in the driver's seat of his old blue pickup, Cooper's head resting against his knee as the truck rattled down the winding dirt road toward Pine Hollow. The town was small, barely more than a collection of weather-beaten buildings clinging to the lakeside, surrounded by a fog that never fully lifted. Jack had barely been there since moving in, preferring the solitude of his cabin, but Harris's warning had left a weight in his chest. He needed answers. He parked in front of Mary's Diner, the kind of place where the coffee was burnt, the bacon too crisp, and the gossip hotter than either. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, the scent of grease and old wood instantly wrapping around him. A handful of locals sat scattered across red vinyl booths. Conversations stilled when they noticed the stranger in the worn leather jacket. Jack offered a nod, but no one returned it. The only sound was the scrape of a spatula on the grill. Behind the counter stood Mary Holloway, a stout woman in her 50s with auburn hair pinned up under a faded bandana. Her face carried the gentle exhaustion of someone who'd spent a lifetime feeding other people's troubles. She smiled politely, though her eyes were curious. "Haven't seen you in before. You must be the new fella up by Stillwater," she said, her voice soft but seasoned with authority. "Jack Turner," he said. "Coffee, black, and maybe whatever's fresh." Mary chuckled. "Honey, nothing's ever fresh here, but I'll bring you something edible." As he waited, Jack scanned the diner. In the far booth near the window, an older man sat alone, stirring his coffee with a deliberate rhythmic motion. His skin was the color of tanned leather, deeply lined from decades under sun and wind. A thick gray beard covered his chin, and his hands, knotted and scarred, looked like they'd been carved from driftwood. His eyes, though faded to a pale sea-glass blue, were sharp and steady. He wore a wool cap and a flannel shirt with patches at the elbows. There was something in his stillness that spoke of patience, the kind learned only from years on the water. Mary followed Jack's gaze. "That's Earl Jenkins," she said quietly, setting down his cup. "Used to fish these waters before his heart gave out last year. Knows every bend and current like his own veins." Jack hesitated only a moment before walking over. "Mind if I join you?" Earl looked up, assessing him with a glance that seemed to weigh his worth. After a pause, he gestured to the empty seat. "Free country." Jack sat. "I heard you know this lake better than most." Earl took a slow sip of coffee. "Depends who's asking." "I've found something near my property," Jack said, his tone careful. "A red life vest. Strap was cut clean. Not torn." The old man froze, spoon suspended midair. His eyes sharpened, all traces of weariness gone. "Red vest, you said?" Jack nodded. Earl set the cup down, his fingers trembling slightly. "That belonged to Hank Doyle," he said finally, voice rough as gravel. "They said he hit a rock, flipped his boat. But Hank was no fool. Man could swim through a storm blindfolded. Been fishing this lake 30 years. He didn't drown by accident." Jack leaned forward. "You think someone killed him?" Earl's jaw tightened. "I think someone wanted folks to believe otherwise, and around here, what people want to believe matters more than what's true." Outside, a gull cried, the sound cutting through the diner's hush. Jack felt the room's air grow heavier, as if the lake itself had reached in to listen. "You knew him well?" Jack asked. "Since we were kids," Earl replied. "He was stubborn, proud, fished even when the season was closed, said the rules were made for men who didn't know how to live off the water. Last time I saw him, he told me he'd found something strange out there near the northern inlet, said the current wasn't right and there was oil on the surface. 2 days later, his boat washed up, empty." Jack's pulse quickened. "Oil?" Earl nodded slowly. "Slicks, rainbow-colored. Didn't smell like fuel from an outboard. Smelled heavier, like diesel. Hank said he was going to tell the sheriff. Guess he didn't get the chance." The silence that followed was taut as a fishing line. "I want to see it," Jack said. Earl studied him for a long time. "You're either brave or stupid, Turner. Maybe both." "Fine. Meet me at the dock after sundown. Bring that dog of yours. He looks like he's got better instincts than most men I know." That evening, the lake was a black mirror under a bruised sky. Earl was waiting by a weathered boat, its paint faded to the color of bone. Cooper trotted beside Jack, tail low, ears twitching. The old man's lantern cast thin circles of gold that wavered on the water. "Hop in," Earl said. "You best keep quiet. Sound carries on the lake." They drifted into deeper waters, the only noise the slow churn of the oar and the soft breath of the dog. The air grew colder, the scent of mud and iron rising from the depths. After a time, Earl pointed. "There. See that shimmer?" Jack squinted. Under the weak light of the moon, a faint, iridescent sheen spread across the surface, oil twisting like a serpent in the current. Cooper began to whine softly, pawing the edge of the boat. Jack's instincts prickled. Without a word, he stripped down to his undershirt and slipped into the freezing water. The cold punched the air from his lungs. He dove, flashlight beams slicing through the murk. Below, a dark mass emerged, the outline of a small fishing vessel resting on its side, swallowed by silt. He swam closer, brushing away debris until he saw the truth. A jagged hole ripped through the hull from the inside. The edges were clean, metallic, melted. It wasn't rot or rock, it was an explosion. When he surfaced, gasping, Earl's face loomed above him, pale and drawn. "Well?" Jack hauled himself back into the boat, water streaming off his clothes. "It wasn't an accident," he said flatly. "Somebody blew that boat apart from the inside." Earl's eyes hardened, grief and rage flashing beneath the surface. Then Hank didn't drown. He was silenced. The lake was utterly still, but the ripples around their boat spread far and wide, as if something beneath had just awakened. The night fell thick over Stillwater Lake, heavy with a silence so complete that even the frogs held their breath. Jack Turner sat near the fireplace, the orange light flickering across his face, casting long shadows over the walls of the cabin. The storm outside had died hours ago, leaving the air unnaturally still. Cooper lay at his feet, half asleep but restless, ears twitching with every subtle groan of the wooden beams. Jack's mind refused to rest. The image of that torn hull, ripped from within, replayed endlessly behind his eyes. Someone had murdered Hank Doyle, and now they knew that he knew. A low hum began to rise from the water outside, faint but growing. Cooper's head shot up, body tense. Jack reached for the lamp, extinguishing it with a soft click. Darkness swallowed the room. He moved to the window, parting the curtain with 2 fingers. Out on the lake, a shape slid across the surface, long, narrow, moving without light. A boat, its motor barely audible. Then came a flash. 2 blinding beams flared to life, sweeping across the cabin like the eyes of a predator. Jack ducked instinctively, heart hammering. The lights lingered for several seconds, searching. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they vanished. The motor faded into silence, leaving only the faint ripple of water against the dock. Jack waited. 5 minutes. 10, nothing. Only the sound of Cooper's low growl, deep and steady. Whoever they were, they hadn't come to talk. He kept watch until dawn. When morning arrived, the lake looked deceptively calm, glittering under the weak sun. Jack went down to check his motorboat. The stench hit first, fuel mixed with something sharp, acidic. The gas tank had been slashed open, its contents replaced with what looked like thick black oil. He ran his hand along the damaged metal, jaw tightening. It wasn't random vandalism. It was a message. He drove to Pine Hollow to find Earl Jenkins. The old fisherman was already at the dock, patching his net, pipe smoke curling lazily around his face. His eyes narrowed when Jack told him what had happened. "They're warning you off," he said quietly. "Same folks who wanted Hank gone." "Then they know we found the wreck," Jack replied. Earl tapped the pipe against the railing. "I got something that might help." From his coat pocket, he unfolded an old map, edges frayed and stained with years of use. "This belonged to Hank. He marked something out here, see? Hidden Bay. It's a cove north of the ridge, cut off from the main current. Locals don't go near it, say the water there swallows sound. Hank thought the smugglers were using it to move contraband, maybe more." Jack studied the spot. "You think that's where they took him?" Earl met his gaze. "If he ain't dead, that's where he'll be." That night, clouds rolled in again, heavy and swollen with rain. Jack and Earl took the fisherman's boat, a dull metal skiff with a handicap, sputtering motor and no navigation lights. Cooper rode between them, fur damp from the drizzle, eyes sharp as amber coals. The world narrowed to the soft slap of oars and the whisper of wind through the reeds. Every sense in Jack's body was alive. When they reached the inlet, Earl cut the engine. The air smelled of oil and salt, unnatural for a freshwater lake. They drifted into a pocket of stillness where the surrounding cliffs formed a half-circle that blocked the sky. Faint light glimmered ahead, lanterns swaying. 3 makeshift cabins stood on stilts above the water, connected by narrow planks. Around them floated several boats loaded with crates. Figures moved in the shadows, armed and silent. Jack's chest tightened. They moored behind a fallen tree and crept closer, staying low. Jack counted at least 6 men. One of them turned, and his stomach lurched. It was Deputy Harris, the silver badge gleaming faintly under his coat. He wasn't investigating smuggling. He was leading it. Beside him, 2 strangers hauled a figure from one of the huts. Jack froze. The man's face was gaunt but familiar. Hank Doyle, alive, shackled, limping, eyes hollow. Earl's whisper broke through the rain. "I'll be damned." Jack's instincts surged. "We need to move now. They're going to kill him." Before Earl could answer, Cooper let out a low bark, sensing movement behind them. Too late. A flashlight beam caught them, followed by a shout. Gunfire erupted, shattering the stillness. Jack shoved Earl behind a crate, bullets slicing through the planks. Cooper lunged forward, teeth bared, slamming into a man emerging from the shadows. The struggle was savage. Snarls, splashes, the crack of bone. Jack fired back toward the huts, hitting one of the smugglers. The lantern swung wildly, light dancing across chaos. Rain came down in sheets, turning everything slick and blinding. Earl managed to free Hank, who could barely stand. Harris's voice boomed over the storm. "You should have stayed in your cabin, Turner." More shots followed, one tearing into the hull of the boat. Cooper yelped as a bullet grazed his flank but didn't stop. He lunged again, tackling a man who had leveled his rifle at Earl. The 2 crashed into the water, thrashing violently until only the dog surfaced, limping back toward shore. Jack fired once more and grabbed Earl's arm. "We're done here. Move." They dragged Hank onto the boat, shoving away from the dock just as another explosion ripped through one of the huts. Flames clawed up the night sky, reflecting red and gold across the rain-slicked water. The lake roared beneath them, alive with fire and thunder. By the time they reached open water, Hank was unconscious. Earl was bleeding from a graze to his shoulder, and Cooper lay trembling at Jack's feet, his fur matted with blood. Jack pressed a hand to the dog's side, feeling the weak rise and fall. "Hold on, boy," he whispered, his voice breaking. Behind them, Hidden Bay burned like a funeral pyre. The rain poured harder, washing away the smoke, but not the blood. On Stillwater Lake, nothing stayed buried for long. The rain had long since vanished, leaving only the scent of pine and the echo of thunder in memory. For the first time in months, Stillwater Lake was quiet again. No gunfire, no burning huts, only the patient rhythm of water brushing the wooden dock. Jack Turner stood there as dawn crept through the mist, his shoulders heavier, but his eyes clearer than they'd been in years. Cooper rested beside him, a clean bandage wrapped around his flank, fur shaved in a neat patch where the bullet had grazed him. The dog's breath came steady now, chest rising and falling like the tide. Jack's hand rested on his head, feeling life beneath his palm. For all that had been lost, that heartbeat was victory enough. 2 days after the battle at Hidden Bay, state police arrived from Helena, summoned by Earl Jenkins's call and the evidence Jack had handed over: a waterproof pouch containing photographs, ammunition fragments, and the melted remains of an explosive detonator from Hank's wreck. It was Lieutenant Grace Holloway who led the investigation, a woman in her early 40s with close-cropped blonde hair and sharp green eyes that carried both empathy and exhaustion. She had the calm of someone who'd seen too much and still refused to look away. Her uniform was crisp but unpretentious, her tone clipped yet never unkind. "You've done more than most would dare," she'd told Jack, flipping through the folder he'd assembled. "But I hope you understand what this means. The sheriff's department won't come back from this clean." Deputy Harris had been arrested within 24 hours. They found cash stashed in oil drums, false death certificates signed by Dr. William Carter, Pine Hollow's aging physician, a man once respected for his charity work, now exposed as the quiet architect of the town's corruption. Carter, in his 60s, had thinning white hair and trembling hands that still bore the steadiness of an old surgeon. When questioned, he confessed without drama. "I did it for the families," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. Insurance money saves more lives than it takes. Jack had watched him from across the room, torn between rage and pity. It was a logic he recognized too well, the same kind that justified impossible orders during war. 3 months passed. Autumn arrived like a benediction. The trees along Stillwater's ridge turned amber and copper, and the lake reflected their colors until it looked as though the world itself were on fire. But this time, a gentle fire, one that warmed instead of destroyed. Jack had stayed. He repaired the cabin, replaced the shattered windows, and fixed the motor on his boat. Every morning, he and Earl took to the water, not as hunters or fugitives, but as caretakers. Earl had changed too. His once constant scowl had softened, though his hands were still calloused and his voice still carried the gravel of age. The bullet wound on his shoulder healed into a crooked scar that he wore like a medal. "Never thought I'd be the law's friend," he'd muttered one afternoon as they tied their boat near the pier. "Guess life's full of bad jokes." But there was gratitude behind the words, unspoken yet understood. Cooper had become a familiar sight in town. Children waved at him as he trotted beside Jack during his patrols, tail high, eyes bright. The dog had taken to sleeping on the porch again, soaking up sunlight as if hoarding warmth for winter. The scar along his rib was pale now, a faint mark against gold fur, but Jack often caught himself tracing it with his eyes, reminded of how close he'd come to losing him. Still, nights were not entirely peaceful. Some scars lingered in the mind. Jack sometimes woke before dawn, the echo of waves against steel bulkheads flooding his dreams. But instead of reaching for a gun or a bottle, he reached for purpose. He volunteered with the local ranger service, guiding rescue patrols along the lake. "It's quieter work," he'd said to Grace when she visited last, "but I think I'm finally fighting the right kind of battles." She'd smiled at that, the tired smile of a soldier recognizing another. One evening, near the close of October, Jack and Earl sat in their boat as the sun dipped low. They had spent the day retrieving fishing lines left adrift, helping a pair of tourists whose canoe had capsized. Cooper dozed between them, the rhythmic slap of water against the hull blending with the rustle of leaves overhead. Earl broke the silence. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Jack's gaze stayed on the horizon, where the last light turned the water molten gold. "I did once. Now I think the lake's where I was meant to stop running." Earl grunted in agreement. "Maybe so. Ain't many places left where a man can start over without losing himself." A loon called in the distance, its cry haunting yet beautiful. Jack smiled faintly. "I used to think peace meant forgetting, but maybe it just means learning to carry it better." The boat drifted, untethered, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to steer. The sun melted into the water, painting everything in copper and rose. Cooper stirred, lifting his head to watch the ripples shimmer. Jack reached down, scratching gently behind his ear. The dog leaned into his hand, content. When darkness finally settled, the lake held their reflections steady. 3 survivors, not heroes, but whole in their own way. Somewhere beneath them lay the wreck of Hank's old boat, now claimed by silt and silence. The secrets of Stillwater had been dragged to the surface, and with them, something in Jack's heart had surfaced too. He looked at the horizon one last time before turning home. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of cedar and the promise of frost. Peace, he realized, was never about erasing pain. It was about walking beside it, quietly, with gratitude that the road still went on. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or angels. They come quietly, like the sunrise over a lake after the longest storm. Jack didn't find peace in forgetting, nor in revenge. He found it in grace, the kind only God can plant inside a heart that's been broken and still chooses to love. Stillwater Lake may have buried secrets, but it also became a place of redemption, proof that even in silence God works through loyal hearts, second chances, and the small kindnesses that ripple farther than we see. Maybe that's the true miracle. Not that pain disappears, but that through it, we become capable of healing others. Like Jack, like Cooper, like anyone who refuses to give up on light, even when the water runs dark. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it. Leave a comment about what faith or forgiveness means to you. Subscribe if you believe that stories, just like people, can carry hope where it's needed most. And tonight, as you rest, may God bless you and those you love. May He calm your storms, guide your steps, and remind you that no matter how deep the waters get, His grace runs deeper still.